He asked the wrong question his entire life, and that is exactly why he was right. Most people, when they want to understand the mind, ask where thoughts come from. Feynman never cared for that framing. He asked something stranger, something that kept him up at night in a way that quantum electrodynamics never quite managed. Where precisely does the mind exist? Not metaphorically, not poetically, physically. And if you think you already know the answer, if you're nodding right now and preparing to say in the brain, obviously, then you're about to have the floor pulled out from under you in the most interesting way possible. Because the question is not as settled as you think. And what you lose by never sitting with it, really sitting with it, is not just an intellectual curiosity. It is something closer to the entire framework through which you experience being alive. Stay with this. If you walk away now, you carry a model of yourself that is almost certainly incomplete, and incomplete models of reality have a way of costing people more than they realize. ¿Te suena? You have felt something like this before. There is a moment, usually quiet, when you catch yourself thinking about thinking. You're lying in bed. The room is dark, the house is still, and you become aware, almost uncomfortably aware, that there's something happening behind your eyes that you cannot fully locate. You reach for it and it retreats. You try to observe it and the observation changes it. It is like trying to see the back of your own head without a mirror, except the mirror does not exist, and you are not entirely sure the head does either, at least not in the way you assumed. Feynman had a version of this moment. He described it in different ways across different decades, in lectures, in interviews, in those wonderful rambling conversations he had with anyone who would stay long enough to disagree with him. And the thread running through all of it was a kind of disciplined refusal to accept comfortable answers. He once said that the first step to knowing something is admitting how much you do not know about it. He was not being modest, he was being surgical. So here's the operating table, here's what we are going to cut open together. The mind, as Feynman would have approached it, is not a thing you have. It is a process happening in you, or possibly through you, or possibly at a scale and in a configuration that your intuitions about location are simply not equipped to handle. And the moment you genuinely absorb that, the moment it stops being a sentence you read and starts being something you feel in the base of your throat, everything shifts. Why do those who think hardest about the mind end up more confused than those who never bother? That question is going to follow us through this entire conversation. Hold it loosely for now. Feynman loved physics because it was honest about its own edges. He had very little patience for fields that pretended their foundations were solid when they were not. And the science of the mind, even today, even with all the neuroimaging and the computational models and the elegant theories, sits on foundations that are, to put it generously, still being poured. The concrete is wet. You can walk on it, but you should probably not throw a party on it yet. Here's a number that Feynman would have loved to torture you with. The human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons. Not cells in general, neurons specifically, and each of those neurons forms, on average, somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 connections with other neurons. Do the arithmetic? That is somewhere in the range of 100 trillion synaptic connections operating simultaneously, adjusting, firing, pruning, reorganizing, all while you're deciding what to have for lunch. The complexity is not just large. It is, in a very specific technical sense, beyond the capacity of any existing system to fully simulate, including the brain trying to simulate itself. Myra, this is where it gets genuinely strange, because when you ask where the mind is, you're implicitly asking where this process lives. And the moment you ask that, you run into something that bothered philosophers long before neuroscience existed, and that bothers neuroscientists just as much today. The hard problem of consciousness. Feynman was careful with philosophy. He respected it in the way a good surgeon respects the territory around a tumor. He did not dismiss it, but he was very clear about what it could and could not do. And the hard problem of consciousness is precisely the kind of question he would have approached with equal amounts of enthusiasm and suspicion. The hard problem, as the philosopher David Chalmers named it, is this: even if you had a complete map of every neuron in the brain, every firing pattern, every chemical gradient, every electrical impulse, you would still have not explained why any of it feels like anything. Why does the electrochemical signal traveling down an optic nerve not just produce a behavioral response to light, but also produce the experience of seeing red. Why is there something it is like to be you reading this right now rather than nothing at all? That gap between the physical description and the felt experience is not a small gap waiting for better microscopes. It is a conceptual chasm that has swallowed some of the most brilliant minds in history. And Feynman, being Feynman, would not let you pretend it was not there, just because it made you uncomfortable. Veros, there's a paradox at the heart of this. The mind is the only instrument you have for studying the mind. You're the telescope and the astronomer simultaneously. And any astronomer worth their salary will tell you that your instruments introduce distortions. The question is always how much of what you're seeing is really out there and how much is an artifact of the lens. When you introspect, when you look inward and report on your own mental states, you're using a cognitive apparatus that evolved not to produce accurate philosophical self-reports, but to survive, to predict threats, to find food, to recognize faces. That apparatus is magnificent for those tasks. It may be deeply unreliable for the task of understanding itself. This is the paradox of the mind studying the mind. The more honestly you look, the less certain you become, and the less certain you become, the closer you are to actually understanding something real. Feynman understood this about physics before most physicists were willing to say it out loud. Quantum mechanics, which he helped develop into one of the most precise predictive theories in the history of science, is also one of the most conceptually bewildering. It works. It works with a precision that would make an engineer weep with gratitude. And yet nobody, including Feynman, fully understood what it meant. He said this openly. He said, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you do not understand quantum mechanics. He was not being coy. He was making a serious epistemological point. Sometimes the map is so accurate that you mistake it for the territory, and that mistake is the most dangerous one you can make. The same applies here. We have very good maps of the brain. We have increasingly good maps of which regions activate during which tasks, which neurotransmitters correlate with which states, which disruptions produce which deficits. These maps are genuinely useful, but they are maps of the hardware, and the question of where the mind exists is, at least in part, a question about the relationship between the hardware and something else that the hardware appears to be doing, something we call experience, awareness, subjectivity, the felt sense of being someone looking out from behind particular eyes at a particular moment in time. Now here's something Feynman would have found deliciously uncomfortable. The evidence is mounting that the mind, whatever it is, does not live neatly inside the skull. This is not mysticism. This is not the kind of thing that requires incense and a suspicious attitude toward empirical evidence. This is coming from cognitive science, from embodied cognition research, from the study of how organisms process information about the world. The emerging view, supported by decades of careful experiment, is that cognition is not something the brain does in isolation. Cognition is something the brain does in constant, dynamic, inseparable interaction with the body and the environment. The mind is not a program running on the brain the way a word processor runs on a laptop. The mind is more like weather. It is a phenomenon that arises from a system, and the system includes the body, the nervous system distributed throughout it, the sensory surfaces, the motor outputs, and the structured environment they all move through. Feynman had a version of this intuition, though he would not have used that language. He talked often about how thinking was physical for him. He would wiggle his fingers when he was working through a problem. He drew pictures. He wrote things down not to record them, but to think them, because the act of writing changed the thinking. He once half-seriously argued that his notebook was part of his mind, that the thinking did not happen only in his head, but in the interaction between his head and his hands in the paper. He was, without using the academic term, describing an extended mind. The philosopher Andy Clark and the cognitive scientist David Chalmers wrote a paper in 1998 that asked whether a notebook could, in principle, be part of your mind. Their argument was not that paper is conscious, but that if a cognitive process, memory, planning, reasoning, can be reliably offloaded to an external system in a way that is functionally integrated with your internal processes, then there's no principled reason to draw the boundary of the mind at the skull. The skull is a convenient anatomical line. It is not necessarily a cognitive one. This should feel slightly vertiginous. It is supposed to, because it means that when you ask where your mind is, the honest answer might be partially here in the firing patterns of neurons, partially there in the tension you hold in your jaw when you're working through a difficult problem, partially out there in the tools you use, the people you talk to, the environment that shapes what thoughts are even possible for you to have. Why do those who think hardest about the mind end up more confused than those who never bother? We are getting closer. Because the harder you look, the more the edges dissolve. And most people find dissolving edges uncomfortable. They want a crisp answer. The mind is here in this box made of these components, end of story. Feynman did not want that. He wanted the question to stay alive, sharp, productive. He understood that a question you can keep interrogating is more valuable than an answer that stops you from thinking. Let us go deeper, because Feynman would not let you stop here. There's a field of research that goes by the name predictive processing, and it is perhaps the most Feynman-esque framework to emerge from neuroscience in the last several decades. The core idea associated with thinkers like Carl Friston and Andy Clark is that the brain is not primarily a passive receiver of sensory information. It is a prediction machine. It is constantly generating models of what it expects to experience, comparing those models with incoming sensory data, and updating the models when the predictions fail. What you experience as perception, what feels like the direct, unmediated presence of the world, is actually a controlled hallucination. It is the brain's best guess, constrained by sensory evidence but not simply read off from it. Feynman would have loved this and been suspicious of it simultaneously, which is exactly the right response. He would have loved it because it is elegant and it makes testable predictions and it reframes familiar phenomena in a genuinely new way. He would have been suspicious of it because it is also very easy to mistake a good metaphor for a complete explanation. The brain as a prediction machine, fine. But what is doing the predicting? What is the subject of the experience when the prediction succeeds? When your brain correctly anticipates the weight of a coffee cup before your hand closes around it, and the felt sense of the cup just is that expectation meeting confirmation, who is feeling it? That question, that stubborn, irritating, beautiful question keeps reappearing. And it does so because the hard problem is not going away, just because we have better process-level descriptions. Feynman understood this class of problem. In physics, you can have a mathematically complete description of a phenomenon and still have profound uncertainty about what that description means, about what is really happening at the level of physical reality. Quantum mechanics again. He lived with that uncertainty for decades. He made peace with it not by resolving it, but by refusing to be paralyzed by it. And this is one of the most practically useful things you can take from a Feynman-style engagement with the mind. You do not need to resolve the hard problem to function, to grow, to make better decisions, to live more consciously. You need to hold it honestly, to know it is there, to let it inform your epistemic humility about your own mental states. That is not a small thing. That is actually enormous. Because here's what happens when people do not hold it honestly: they mistake their current model of reality for reality itself. They assume that what feels certain is certain, that what feels obvious is obvious, that their inner sense of who they are and why they do what they do is accurate. And neuroscience, psychology, cognitive science, they all converge on the same uncomfortable finding: it mostly is not. The stories you tell yourself about your own motivations are largely confabulated after the fact. The decisions you think you make consciously are often preceded by neural activity that occurred before your conscious awareness of the decision. The self that feels unified and continuous is, at the neural level, a construction, a narrative assembled from disparate processes, not a single thing sitting at the controls. Myra. This is where Feynman's irreverence becomes genuinely liberating. He had no patience for the idea that the self needed to be protected from uncomfortable truths about itself. He thought that was cowardice dressed up as wisdom. He believed, with the conviction of someone who had actually lived it, that the most interesting way to be human was to be willing to be wrong about yourself, to update, to notice the gap between your model and the data and close it, even when closing it hurts. There is a body correlate to this, and Feynman, who was deeply attentive to his own physical states, would have recognized it immediately. When you encounter information that challenges your self-model, that suggests your mind is not quite what you thought it was, or that your reasoning is less reliable than you assumed, there is a specific sensation. Not in the chest, not in the familiar region of emotional resonance, it sits at the back of the neck, a subtle tightening, the muscles there going slightly rigid as if bracing for something. That is the body's version of resistance. That is the physical signature of a model defending itself against revision. And noticing it, naming it, breathing through it rather than acting from it. That is the beginning of real intellectual honesty. Feynman practiced this. He was notorious among his students for being willing to say, in front of a room full of people, "I was wrong. Let me think about this again." Not as a performance of humility, as a genuinely desired outcome. He wanted to be corrected because he wanted to be right more than he wanted to appear right. That distinction between wanting to be right and wanting to appear right is one of the most important distinctions a mind can make about itself. Why do those who think hardest about the mind end up more confused than those who never bother? Here's the answer, finally, because thinking hard about the mind reveals its own limitations. And most minds are not trained to find that revelation thrilling rather than threatening. That is what made him Feynman. Now let us take this somewhere that Feynman himself was heading in the later decades of his life, somewhere he spoke about with increasing seriousness in the 1970s and 80s. The question of what the mind is made of at the deepest level and whether the physics of that level has anything strange to say about consciousness. This is territory where you must be careful. The history of consciousness research is littered with people who saw quantum mechanics and thought, "Here's my escape from the mechanistic picture." They invoked quantum uncertainty to smuggle free will back in. They used quantum entanglement to hint at mystical non-locality of consciousness. Feynman had no patience for this. He was very clear. Quantum mechanics does not magically explain consciousness just because both are mysterious. Two mysteries are not an explanation. You need an actual mechanism, an actual account of how the quantum level connects to the phenomenal level, and nobody has that yet. But, and this is a crucial, but Feynman also believed that dismissing a question because it has been misused by enthusiasts is itself an intellectual error. The question of whether the physical substrate of thought operates in ways that are not captured by classical neuroscience is a real question. It is not resolved. The Penrose-Hameroff hypothesis about quantum processes in microtubules is widely criticized and probably wrong. But the criticism should be scientific, not defensive. Feynman's standard was always, does the evidence support it? If not, say so clearly. If unknown, say that clearly too. What is known is this: the neural correlates of consciousness are correlations, not explanations. We know that certain patterns of neural activity accompany certain conscious experiences. We do not know why those patterns give rise to experience, rather than simply to more neural activity. That gap is where the honest science lives, in the admission that we are still at the very early stages of understanding what the mind is. Escucha, and this matters enormously for how you live. If the mind is not fully understood, if its location is not as simple as inside the skull, if its boundaries extend into the body and possibly beyond, if the self is a constructed narrative rather than a fixed entity, then you're more plastic than you think. You're more capable of change than the fixed story of yourself allows. You're less bound to the interpretations you have always made of your own experience than you feel. The sense of being stuck, the sense that you're just the kind of person who does or does not do certain things, that sense is itself a product of the mind's model of itself, and models can be updated. Feynman updated his constantly. He learned to play bongo drums as an adult and played them badly for years before he played them well, because he found the learning itself irresistible. He learned Portuguese because he wanted to give a physics lecture in Brazil and thought it would be more interesting that way. He took up drawing in his 50s because someone told him it would be interesting and he agreed. He had, in the most literal neurological sense, a highly plastic mind, not because he was born with some special gift, but because he maintained the conditions that keep minds plastic: genuine curiosity, willingness to be a beginner, tolerance for confusion, delight in difficulty. And this connects directly to the question of where the mind exists. Because a mind that is plastic, that is genuinely open to revision, that maintains what the Zen tradition calls beginner's mind, and what Feynman called the joy of not knowing yet, that mind has a different relationship to its own location. It does not clutch. It does not defend its borders. It extends naturally into new domains, new relationships, new environments, because it does not believe its own boundaries are real in the first place. The mind that insists it knows exactly what it is and exactly where it is the mind that has stopped growing. And a mind that stops growing, Feynman would say, is not really doing its job. Because the job of a mind, its evolutionary mandate, its deepest function, is to model reality more accurately over time, to close the gap between the map and the territory. And you cannot close that gap if you have decided the map is already complete. Here's something that Feynman said in different forms across many conversations. He said that the imagination of nature is far greater than the imagination of man. He meant this literally. He meant that the universe keeps turning up solutions, structures, phenomena that no human mind would have predicted, and that this should produce in you a permanent structural humility about your own cognitive reach. Not despair, not paralysis. Humility, the kind that keeps you looking. Applied to the mind itself, this becomes the reality of what you are, what consciousness is, what subjectivity is, what the relationship between brain and experience turns out to be, will almost certainly be stranger and more interesting than any of our current theories. The neuroscientists are not wrong. The philosophers are not wasting their time. The cognitive scientists are building something genuinely useful, but none of them have the complete picture, and the honest ones know it. The ones worth listening to are the ones who say, here's what we know, here's what we think, here's where the evidence runs out, and here's why that is exciting rather than embarrassing. Now there's one more layer to this that Feynman would insist we reach, because he always insisted on going one layer deeper than comfort permitted, and it has to do with time. The mind, whatever it is, wherever it lives, exists in time. This seems obvious, but sit with it. Your experience right now is not a snapshot, it is a duration. There's something philosophers call the specious present, the felt window of now, which turns out to be not a point but a span, roughly 2 to 3 seconds of experience that the brain integrates into a coherent moment. The past few seconds are still active in your processing, and the near future is already being anticipated. What you experience as now is actually a constructed interval, a temporal bubble assembled by your nervous system to give you the illusion of a continuous present. The sensation of this, if you tune into it, is felt not in the brain. You cannot feel directly, but somewhere around the eyes, just behind them, a kind of pressure that is actually the strain of attending, of holding the present moment together. It is subtle and it is real, and Feynman, who was extraordinarily attentive to his own perceptual states, would have found it interesting precisely because it is so easy to miss. This temporal construction of the present means that your mind, even considered purely within your own skull, is not a thing existing at a point in time. It is a process with temporal extent. It stretches backward into memory and forward into anticipation. The you of this moment includes traces of the you of many previous moments and projections of the you of moments that have not happened yet. The boundary of the self in time is as fuzzy as its boundary in space. Feynman thought about his own mortality with an unusual directness. He was diagnosed with a rare form of kidney cancer in 1986 and died 2 years later. In that period, he talked about death the way he talked about physics, with curiosity, with a refusal to sentimentalize, and with a kind of steady attention that most people reserve only for things they enjoy. He said he had no desire to pretend he would live forever and no interest in the various consolations people offered. He wanted to understand what dying was as much as a person could from the inside, and he approached it the same way he approached everything else, as a phenomenon worth examining. What this suggests about the mind is something important. If the mind is a process and processes end, then the question of where the mind exists includes the question of when it exists. It has a beginning. It will have an end. And in between, it is not a fixed object, but an unfolding pattern, a standing wave in the neural substrate, shaped by every experience, every relationship, every choice to pay attention or look away. Veros, this is both terrifying and, in the Feynman sense, wonderful. Terrifying because it strips away the illusion of permanence. Wonderful because it means the mind is genuinely creative in a deep sense, not just capable of creativity, but constitutively shaped by what it encounters, by what it chooses to engage with, by the quality of attention it brings to experience. You're in a literal and not merely motivational sense, building your mind with every choice you make about what to notice. Feynman noticed everything. He noticed the way light scattered through a glass of water and spent an afternoon thinking about what it implied about the nature of color. He noticed the wobble of a spinning plate in a university cafeteria and followed the mathematics of that wobble until it led him eventually to work that contributed to his Nobel Prize. He noticed his own confusion when he encountered a problem he could not solve and treated that confusion not as a failure but as a signal, a flag marking the exact location where the interesting work needed to happen. This is the practical upshot of everything we have explored. The mind is not a box, it is not a fixed location, it is not a thing that either works or does not work. It is a process that either grows or contracts, that either extends toward reality or retreats from it. And the primary variable controlling that growth or contraction is the quality of your attention, whether it is fearful or curious, defensive or open, convinced it already knows or genuinely interested in finding out. Why do those who think hardest about the mind end up more confused than those who never bother? Because confusion, real confusion, the kind that arises when your model encounters the edges of its own adequacy, is the beginning of understanding. The people who never bother are not less confused. They are just not aware of their confusion. They carry a model that does not fit the territory and they never notice the mismatch because they never look closely enough. The people who think hard and arrive at genuine confusion have arrived somewhere real. They have found the edge of the map, and the edge of the map is exactly where Feynman always wanted to be. There is a question that sits underneath all of this, one that Feynman never answered definitively and never pretended to, and it is the question that makes everything else interesting. Is there something it is like to the universe? He would have phrased it differently. He would have said, is awareness a local phenomenon, something that arises only in sufficiently complex nervous systems, or is it in some form more fundamental to reality than our current physics allows? He was not endorsing panpsychism. He was not endorsing anything. He was refusing to close a question that was not yet ready to be closed. The honest answer is, we do not know. The honest next sentence is, this is thrilling. Because if awareness turns out to be more fundamental than we currently believe, if there is something in the structure of reality that predisposes it toward experience, then the question of where your mind exists opens outward, not inward. It connects your experience not just to the 86 billion neurons in your skull, but to the broader physical reality those neurons are made of. Atoms forged in stellar cores, particles whose quantum states have been interacting since the beginning of the universe, matter that has been organized and reorganized across billions of years into the precise configuration that is right now, reading these words and wondering about itself. You're the universe looking at itself. Feynman said something like this in less poetic terms. He said that when he looked at a flower, he saw it with the same atoms that the flower was made of, that there was no clean line between the observer and the observed, that physics itself had complicated the intuition, that there is a world out there and a mind in here perceiving it. The quantum measurement problem, which remains unsolved, sits at precisely this boundary. The act of observation changes the system observed, which means the observer is not cleanly outside the system, which means the boundary between mind and world is not where common sense puts it. This is the vertigo Feynman enjoyed. Not the paralytic kind, but the productive kind. The kind that shakes loose your assumptions and leaves you looking at your own hand and thinking, this is stranger and more interesting than I had understood. The mind exists, as best as current science can say, in the dynamic interaction between neural processes and body states, and environmental structures, unfolding through time, constructed moment by moment, never fixed, never simply located, always in the process of becoming something slightly different from what it was a moment ago. It is not a noun, it is a verb, it is not a place, it is a movement. And the movement that Feynman modeled, the movement worth imitating, is toward greater honesty, greater precision, greater willingness to sit with complexity, greater delight in the fact that the questions are not finished, because finished questions are dead questions. Living questions are the ones that keep pulling you forward. Here's where we leave you, not with a resolution, because there is none yet, but with a reorientation. The question of where the mind exists is not a question that will be answered in a single video or a single lifetime. But engaging with it seriously, following it the way Feynman followed the wobble of that cafeteria plate, changes the mind doing the asking. It makes it more supple, more honest, more capable of the kind of clear seeing that both science and ordinary life require. The palms of your hands right now, the fine motor system that would translate a thought into a gesture, that is part of it, the space behind your eyes where attention seems to originate, that is part of it. The words forming meaning as they arrive, the syntax unfolding in real time, the sense that this is directed at you, specifically you, that is part of it too. The mind is wherever all of that is happening at once, and that is not a place you can point to on a map, which is exactly what makes it interesting. Feynman was asked once what he would do if he could be reborn knowing nothing about physics. He said he would learn physics again. Not because it was the only thing worth knowing, but because it was the best method he had found for the thing he actually wanted to do, which was to understand nature without lying to himself about how much he understood. The same spirit applies here. You do not need to resolve the mystery of consciousness to live a more examined life. You need only to keep the question alive, to resist the temptation of the comfortable wrong answer, and to notice with something like gratitude that you are the kind of thing that can ask the question at all. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. And it is sitting right now, somewhere in the dynamic, extended, temporally unfolding, stubbornly irreducible fact of your awareness, reading this sentence, already moving on to the next thought, already becoming something slightly different than it was when you started. The mind is there, and there, and there. And every time you look for it with genuine curiosity rather than anxious certainty, you're doing exactly what Feynman would have wanted you to do.